The dolls of Whispering Hollow. The thick fog covered the Georgia pine trees that morning. It had been there for a whole week now, like a gray blanket that made everything quiet. The people in the small town of Whispering Hollow who were smart enough to pay attention knew something was wrong. It was 1861, and while most of the South was thinking about the coming war between the states, the people in this lonely town had bigger problems right in their own backyard. At the edge of town, where the forest grew thick and dark, stood the Blackwood estate. It was a big, old mansion that looked like a guard watching over the wild woods. Inside lived young Abigail Blackwood with her father, Thaddeus. He used to be a well-known doctor, but not many people came to see him anymore. The townspeople whispered about the father and daughter when they thought no one was listening. They would stop talking whenever either of the Blackwoods came near. But it wasn't the strange doctor that scared people the most. It was his daughter. "She's not right in the head," Martha Wilkes would whisper to anyone who would listen while she worked at the general store. "Ever since her mama died, that girl has been touched by something evil. You mark my words." Most people agreed with Martha. At 16 years old, Abigail Blackwood should have been thinking about boys and parties. But people hardly ever saw her in town except when she went with her father to buy things they needed. Even then, she moved in a scary way. Her eyes, one blue, one green, never seemed to blink as they looked at everything around her with cold interest. But it wasn't just her strange stare or the way she never talked that made people cross to the other side of the street when they saw her coming. It was what she always carried with her, holding it in her arms like a baby. One of her dolls. These weren't normal toys. Each one was almost as big as a small child. They had faces made of fine china that looked almost real. Their glass eyes caught the light in ways that made them seem to follow you when you moved. Their tiny mouths were sewn shut with expressions that looked like they were stuck between smiles and scary faces. "She makes them herself," Sheriff Tobias Mercer had once told a traveling salesman who asked about the strange girl. "Designs them, sews them, paints them. Has a whole bunch of them up there in that house. Some folks say she talks to them like they're real people." What the sheriff didn't say, what nobody in Whispering Hollow liked to talk about, was how the dolls always looked just like certain people from town. The features were similar enough that you could tell who they were supposed to be, but twisted in small ways that made them even more frightening. With these worried thoughts in his mind, Reverend Jonathan Miller walked up the winding path to the Blackwood estate on that foggy morning in late March. He held his Bible tight against his chest for comfort, though he would never admit that's what he was doing. The old leather book was worn smooth from years of use, its pages bent and well-loved, showing how devoted the Reverend was. He hadn't wanted to come. The night before, he had spent most of his time on his knees praying, asking God for guidance, or maybe a sign that he could wait to make this trip. No sign had come, so when the sun came up, he set out to do his job as the town's spiritual leader. The Hendersons had been missing for 3 days now. Caleb and Mary Henderson, along with their young son Thomas, had not come to Sunday church. This was so unusual that it worried everyone right away. When people went to check their small farmhouse and found no sign of the family, the town organized a search party. They found nothing, and as worry turned to fear, many people began looking suspiciously toward the Blackwood estate. "I'm not saying for sure," Tobias had told the Reverend after yesterday's failed search. But Abigail was seen near the Henderson place last week, just standing there at the edge of their land, watching the house with one of those dolls in her arms. So it was up to Reverend Miller to visit the Blackwoods and ask, carefully of course, if they knew anything about where the family might be. He was very nervous about this job because, like many others, he had never felt comfortable around Abigail. As he got closer to the big front doors of the mansion, Miller couldn't help but notice how the once beautiful estate had fallen apart. Paint was peeling from the columns that held up the upper balcony, and several windows were covered with boards, making it look like a face with closed eyes. The gardens that had once been Abigail's mother's pride had grown wild and messy, with roses and thorns twisted together. He lifted the brass door knocker, which he noticed uncomfortably was shaped like a small hand, and let it fall against the wood with a sound that seemed to echo through the quiet morning. For a long moment, no one answered, and Miller was about to turn and leave when he heard soft footsteps coming from inside. The door creaked open, and the Reverend found himself face to face, not with Thaddeus as he had expected, but with Abigail herself. She wore a high-collared dress of midnight blue, her black hair pulled back tightly, which made her sharp features look even more severe. In her arms, she held what looked like her newest creation, a doll with golden curls just like those of young Thomas Henderson. "Reverend Miller," she said, her voice so soft that he had to lean forward to hear her. "What a nice surprise. Father is in his study. Will you come in?" There was something in her tone that made it clear this wasn't really a question. Before he could think of a proper answer, Miller found himself stepping into the dimly lit entrance hall of the Blackwood home. The door swung shut behind him with a sound that sent a chill down his spine. "Don't worry about how things look," Abigail continued, leading him through the entrance hall toward what he guessed was Thaddeus's study. "Since Mother died, we haven't had much use for most of the rooms. Father and I like to keep to ourselves." The inside of the mansion was as neglected as the outside, with dusty furniture covered in sheets like ghosts. The wallpaper, once a rich red color, had faded to look like dried blood and was peeling away in long strips that curled like dying fingers. But it wasn't the decay that disturbed the Reverend most. It was the dolls. They were everywhere, sitting on chairs, propped in corners, arranged on shelves that lined the walls. Dozens of glass eyes followed him as he walked through the house. Dozens of sewn mouths seemed to whisper secrets he couldn't quite hear. Each doll was dressed in beautiful tiny clothes. Each was positioned as if frozen in the middle of some everyday activity. "My children," Abigail said, noticing where he was looking. "Father says I shouldn't call them that, but they're more loyal than any real family could ever be. They never disappoint me. They never leave." Miller swallowed hard, forcing a smile that felt fake. "They are very impressive, Miss Blackwood. Your skill is remarkable." "You're kind to say so, Reverend. Not everyone appreciates my art." She paused before a closed door, shifting the doll in her arms so that its face was turned toward him. "This is my newest. I've named him Thomas. Do you like him?" The resemblance was unmistakable. The same button nose, the same chubby cheeks as the missing Henderson boy. Even the small birthmark below the left eye had been perfectly recreated. Miller felt his mouth go dry, his heart starting to pound against his ribs. "It's very lifelike," he managed at last. "The detail is extraordinary." Abigail's mismatched eyes seemed to glow with pleasure at the compliment. "I take great care with each one. The eyes are the most important part, windows to the soul and all that. But I shouldn't keep you waiting. Father will be eager to see you." She pushed open the study door without knocking, showing a room that was completely different from the rest of the house. Unlike the abandoned, decaying spaces they had passed through, Thaddeus Blackwood's study was perfect. Every surface was polished to a high shine. Every book on the extensive shelves was perfectly lined up. Every instrument on his desk was arranged with surgical precision. The doctor himself sat behind a massive oak desk, his thin frame looking almost lost in the large leather chair. He looked up from his work, some sort of detailed drawing, Miller noticed, and looked at his visitor with mild surprise. "Reverend Miller," he said, standing up with a smoothness that seemed too young for his age. Thaddeus Blackwood was a man in his late 50s, his once dark hair now streaked with silver, his face lined with deep furrows that spoke of both wisdom and worry. "This is an unexpected honor. Please sit." As Miller took the offered chair, Abigail moved to stand beside her father, still holding the doll that looked so much like Thomas Henderson. The family resemblance between father and daughter was striking. The same high cheekbones, the same curved nose, the same thin lips that rarely smiled. But where Thaddeus's eyes were both a warm brown, Abigail's remained that unsettling combination of blue and green. "I apologize for coming without notice," Miller began, his hands fidgeting with the brim of his hat. "But I'm afraid I come on a matter of some urgency." "Regarding the Hendersons, I presume?" Thaddeus asked, his tone casual, as though they were discussing nothing more important than the weather. Miller felt a jolt of surprise. "You know about their disappearance?" "My dear Reverend, There is very little that happens in Whispering Hollow without my knowledge. Thaddeus leaned back in his chair, putting his fingertips together under his chin. The Hendersons' absence has been noted, of course. Most concerning. Indeed, Miller replied, struggling to stay calm. They are God-fearing people, not the sort to abandon their responsibilities without a word. The entire town is very worried about their welfare. And naturally, your thoughts turn to us. It wasn't a question, and there was no accusation in the doctor's tone, just a statement of fact. That is to say. Miller fumbled for words, very aware of Abigail's unblinking stare. You needn't apologize, Reverend, Thaddeus said, waving a dismissive hand. I am well aware of how we are seen in town. The reclusive doctor and his strange daughter. We make convenient suspects when things go wrong. Miller felt shame creep up his neck. No one is making accusations, Dr. Blackwood. I merely thought, since your property borders the Henderson farm, you might have noticed something unusual in recent days. Ah, I see. Thaddeus nodded thoughtfully. Well, I'm afraid I've been quite absorbed in my work lately. Haven't ventured beyond our grounds in some time. He glanced at his daughter. Abigail, my dear, you take your daily walks near the Henderson place, do you not? Have you observed anything out of the ordinary? For the first time since entering the study, Abigail's gaze shifted away from the Reverend, focusing instead on the doll in her arms. Nothing unusual, Father, though I did notice their dog was loose 2 days ago. Poor creature seemed quite upset. There you see. Thaddeus spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. Beyond a loose dog, we have no insights to offer. Though, of course, if we can be of any help in the search, you need only ask. Miller nodded, though the knot of worry in his stomach had only gotten tighter. There was something in the doctor's manner, a certain smoothness, a practiced ease that felt false. And Abigail's doll, with its scary resemblance to the missing boy. I appreciate your time, he said at last, getting to his feet. If you should happen to remember anything that might be helpful, I trust you'll send word right away. Without question, Thaddeus assured him, also standing. Abigail will see you out, Reverend. I would come with you myself, but I'm afraid I'm at a critical point in my work. As Miller followed Abigail back through the maze of neglected rooms and watching dolls, he found himself seized by a sudden, overwhelming urge to run from the house, to flee this place and never return. Yet something held him back, some sense of duty that wouldn't let him leave without one final try. At the front door, as Abigail reached for the handle, he cleared his throat. Miss Blackwood, he said, forcing himself to meet her mismatched gaze. That doll you're carrying, the one you've named Thomas, it bears a striking resemblance to the Henderson boy. If he had expected her to show signs of discomfort or guilt, he was disappointed. Abigail merely smiled. A small, secret expression that didn't reach her eyes. Does it? I hadn't noticed. I suppose all children share certain features, do they not? Innocence has its own look. Indeed, Miller replied, unable to stop a shiver. Well, I shall take my leave. Good day to you, Miss Blackwood. Good day, Reverend, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Do be careful on your return to town. The paths through the woods can be dangerous for those who don't know the way. It wasn't until he was halfway down the winding drive, the weight of unseen eyes still pressing on his back, that Reverend Miller realized what had been bothering him throughout the entire visit. In all the rooms they had passed through, among all the dolls that lined the walls and filled the corners, he had seen 3 that seemed newer than the rest. One with Caleb Henderson's sturdy build and reddish beard, one with Mary's gentle smile and auburn hair, and the third, of course, with young Thomas's golden curls. The Reverend walked faster, no longer caring about the dignity of his office or the mud that splattered his polished shoes. Behind him, the Blackwood mansion seemed to loom larger than before, its windows like watchful eyes tracking his retreat. By the time he reached the town, the fog had begun to lift, showing a sky the color of tarnished silver. Miller went straight to the sheriff's office, his mind racing with the implications of what he had seen, or thought he had seen. For now, even as his logical mind insisted there must be an innocent explanation, a deeper part of him recognized the truth. Something terrible had happened to the Hendersons, and Abigail Blackwood knew exactly what it was. Sheriff Tobias Mercer was a practical man. At 45, he had seen enough of life's cruelties to have developed thick skin, yet not so much that he had lost his basic humanity. He had served as Whispering Hollow's law enforcement for nearly 20 years, and in that time he had dealt with everything from petty theft to the occasional violent fight. But never in all his years of service had he faced anything like the situation that was now unfolding. "Dolls," he repeated. His weathered face creased in a frown as he looked at the Reverend across his messy desk. "You're basing these suspicions on dolls that looked like the Hendersons." Miller leaned forward, his normally calm features flushed with urgency. "Not just looked like, Tobias. They were perfect copies. Every detail, right down to the birthmark on young Thomas's cheek. And the way she spoke of them as her children. There's something deeply wrong in that house." The sheriff sighed, rubbing a hand across his stubbled jaw. He had known Jonathan Miller for most of his life and had never known him to have wild ideas. If the Reverend was disturbed by what he had seen at the Blackwood estate, there was likely good reason for concern. "I don't disagree that Abigail Blackwood is an unsettling young woman," he said carefully, "and her father has grown strange since his wife's death. But making dolls that look like townspeople, odd as it may be, isn't a crime." "It's more than that," Miller insisted. "There was something wrong about the whole meeting. The way Dr. Blackwood seemed to be expecting my questions about the Hendersons, the way Abigail watched me like she was memorizing my features." He shuddered at the thought. "I fear for that family, Tobias. I truly do." Mercer was silent for a long moment, weighing his options. The Blackwoods, for all their strangeness, were still among the town's founding families. Thaddeus, despite his dwindling practice, remained a respected physician. To make accusations against them without solid evidence would be politically dangerous, to say the least. And yet, 3 people were missing: good people, honest people. And if there was even the slightest chance that the Blackwoods were involved. "All right," he said at last, getting to his feet. "I'll pay a visit to the Blackwood place myself. Take a look around, ask a few questions. But Jonathan, I need you to keep this between us for now. No sense stirring up the town until we know more." Miller nodded, relief washing over his features. "Of course, discretion is essential. But please, Tobias, be careful. There's something in Abigail's eyes that chills the blood." "I've faced worse than a strange girl with a doll collection," Mercer assured him, though in truth he was not as confident as he pretended. He had always given the Blackwood estate a wide berth, and not merely out of respect for the family's privacy. After the Reverend had left, Mercer took his time preparing for the visit. He cleaned and loaded his revolver, a precaution he told himself was routine, though he had rarely felt the need to do so before venturing out in Whispering Hollow. He also wrote a brief note detailing his intentions, which he left in his desk drawer for his deputy to find should he not return by nightfall. It was past noon when he set out for the Blackwood estate, the earlier fog having given way to thin, watery sunlight that did little to warm the chill air. As he rode, Mercer found his thoughts turning to the rumors that had circulated about the Blackwoods over the years. Whispers of strange noises coming from the mansion at night, of lights seen moving through the woods on moonless evenings, of livestock found mysteriously killed on neighboring farms. None of these stories had ever amounted to anything concrete, and Mercer had dismissed them as the typical superstitions that tended to attach themselves to wealthy, reclusive families. Now, however, he found himself wondering if there might have been some truth to them after all. The Blackwood estate appeared even more imposing in the pale afternoon light than it had during the Reverend's morning visit. The mansion seemed to crouch among the ancient oaks that surrounded it, its weathered front bearing an expression that Mercer could only describe as watchful. As he approached the front entrance, he noticed something he had not observed on his previous infrequent visits: a series of small, almost invisible symbols carved into the wood of the doorframe. They were not decorative in any normal sense. Their angular forms suggested something older, more primitive than mere ornamentation. Mercer frowned, running a finger over one of the markings. It reminded him of the protective symbols his grandmother had sometimes drawn, though these seemed somehow reversed, as though designed not to keep evil out, but to hold something in. Before he could think about this further, the door swung open, revealing Thaddeus Blackwood. The doctor appeared more haggard than Mercer remembered, with dark circles beneath his eyes, suggesting recent sleepless nights. Nevertheless, he greeted the sheriff with his customary politeness. "Sheriff Mercer," he said, his voice showing only mild surprise. "2 visitors in one day. We are becoming quite social. Please come in." Mercer stepped into the entrance hall, instantly struck by the oppressive stillness of the house. It was more than mere quiet. It was an absence of sound so complete that it seemed to press against his eardrums. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed muffled, as though fighting against the silence. "I assume you're here about the Hendersons as well," Thaddeus continued, leading the way toward his study. "Reverend Miller was quite concerned this morning. I wish I could offer more insight, but as I told him, we have observed nothing unusual." "I'd still like to ask a few questions if you don't mind," Mercer replied, his eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway. Unlike Miller, he had never been inside the Blackwood home before, and he found himself unprepared for the sheer number of dolls that occupied nearly every available space. They lined the walls in neat rows, sat arranged in scenes on side tables, peered down from specially built shelves. Each was beautifully crafted, with painted porcelain faces and real human hair, or what appeared to be human hair, arranged in various styles. Their clothing was equally detailed, from miniature lace collars to tiny leather shoes. "My daughter's creations," Thaddeus explained, noticing the sheriff's attention. "Abigail has always had a talent for doll making. Her mother encouraged it, said it would make her an excellent mother someday." A shadow passed over his features. "That was before, of course." "Before?" Mercer prompted when the doctor did not elaborate. "Before Eleanor, my wife, succumbed to her illness. Before Abigail's change." There was something in the way he said the word change that caused the hairs on the back of Mercer's neck to rise. Before he could inquire further, however, they had reached the study, and Thaddeus was gesturing for him to enter. The room was much as Miller had described it, perfectly organized, with medical texts lining the walls and a large desk dominating the center. What the Reverend had not mentioned was the peculiar odor that hung in the air, a sweet, cloying scent that reminded Mercer of the embalming fluid used by the town's undertaker. "Please sit," Thaddeus offered, indicating a high-backed chair opposite the desk. "Abigail is in her workroom at present, but I'm sure she'll join us shortly. She has always been fascinated by your position in the community." Mercer settled into the chair, fighting the urge to loosen his collar. Despite the coolness of the day, the study felt uncomfortably warm, and the strange scent made his head swim slightly. "Dr. Blackwood," he began, forcing himself to focus. "When exactly was the last time you saw or had contact with any of the Henderson family?" Thaddeus considered the question, tapping his fingers thoughtfully against the polished surface of his desk. "I believe Caleb came to see me about 2 weeks ago. A persistent cough that had been troubling him. Nothing serious. I prescribed a tonic that seemed to ease the symptoms." "And Mrs. Henderson? Or the boy?" "Mary occasionally helps with the church socials, as does Abigail when she's feeling sociable. They may have spoken recently. As for young Thomas," he frowned slightly, "I can't recall any specific interaction." Mercer nodded, making a mental note of the timeline. "Reverend Miller mentioned that Abigail was seen near the Henderson property last week. Do you know what business she might have had there?" A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, or concern, passed across the doctor's face. "Abigail takes daily walks for her health. Her route often takes her past several properties, including the Hendersons. I hardly think her presence there is cause for suspicion." "No one's making accusations, Dr. Blackwood," Mercer assured him, using the same diplomatic tone he'd perfected over years of dealing with the town's more sensitive situations. "I'm simply trying to gather information that might help us locate the family." "Of course," Thaddeus agreed, his expression smoothing once more into polite attention. "And I wish you success in your efforts. The Hendersons are fine people. There was something in the way he used the present tense, are, not were, that Mercer found reassuring. Perhaps his and Miller's concerns were unfounded after all. Perhaps there was a perfectly innocent explanation for the family's disappearance. And yet, as he prepared to ask his next question, Mercer became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere of the room. The air seemed to thicken, the shadows in the corners deepening as though night were falling, despite the early hour. "Father," came a soft voice from the doorway. "You didn't tell me we had another guest." Abigail Blackwood stood on the threshold, her slender frame silhouetted against the dimness of the hallway beyond. She wore a different dress than she had during Miller's visit, this one a deep red that contrasted sharply with the paleness of her skin. In her arms, she cradled not one doll, but two, the Thomas look-alike that had so disturbed the Reverend, and another newer creation that Mercer couldn't quite make out from his position. "Sheriff Mercer is asking about the Hendersons, my dear," Thaddeus explained, rising to his feet. "Perhaps you might offer him some tea while we chat?" The journey from town must have left him thirsty. Abigail's mismatched eyes fixed on Mercer with an intensity that made him fight the urge to squirm in his seat. "Of course, Father. I would be delighted to play hostess." She turned that unsettling gaze to the sheriff. "Do you take sugar, Sheriff Mercer? Or perhaps honey? We keep our own bees, you know. Their honey is quite distinctive." "Just plain, thank you," Mercer replied, not entirely certain he would actually drink whatever she brought. There was something about the girl that set all his instincts on alert, though he couldn't have said exactly what it was. Perhaps it was simply the way she looked at him, as though she were memorizing not just his features, but something deeper, more essential. With a nod that might have been disappointment, Abigail turned and glided from the doorway, the two dolls still clutched to her chest. As she moved, Mercer caught a better glimpse of the second doll and felt his blood run cold. The doll had his face. Not an approximation, not a general likeness, but his exact features, right down to the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the result of a childhood fall. The eyes were the same shade of gray, the hair the same salt and pepper, the expression the same mix of authority and weariness that he saw each morning in his shaving mirror. "Is something wrong, Sheriff?" Thaddeus asked, his tone concerned, but his eyes sharp with observation. Mercer forced himself to look away from the retreating figure of Abigail and her dolls. "No," he lied, his mouth suddenly dry. "Just wool gathering for a moment. Now, about the Hendersons, you mentioned Caleb visited you 2 weeks ago. Was he in good spirits? Did he give any indication that the family might be planning to leave town?" As Thaddeus began to answer, Mercer found his attention divided between the doctor's words and the faint sounds of Abigail moving about somewhere deeper in the house. A cupboard opening and closing, the clatter of china, the soft whistle of a kettle, ordinary household noises that should have been reassuring, but somehow only increased his sense of unease. He was so preoccupied with tracking these distant sounds that he almost missed the significance of what Thaddeus was saying. So while Caleb didn't specifically mention any travel plans, he did express some concern about Abigail's interest in young Thomas. Mercer's focus snapped back to the present. "I beg your pardon? What kind of interest?" Thaddeus sighed, a sound of parental resignation. "Nothing inappropriate, I assure you. Abigail has always been fond of children, though she has few opportunities to interact with them given our somewhat isolated lifestyle. She had taken to leaving small gifts for the boy, carved wooden animals mostly, though I believe she also crafted a doll for him at one point." Caleb objected to these gifts. He felt they were excessive, perhaps, or merely strange, coming from a young woman Thomas barely knew. The doctor spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "I spoke to Abigail about respecting the family's boundaries, of course, and she assured me she would. That was the last I heard of the matter." Mercer frowned, trying to reconcile this new information with what he already knew, or thought he knew, about the situation. If Abigail had developed some sort of fixation on the Henderson boy, and if Caleb had confronted her about it, his thoughts were interrupted by Abigail's return. She carried a silver tea tray laden with a porcelain pot and 3 delicate cups, which she set on a small table beside her father's desk. The doll with Mercer's face was now propped against her shoulder, its head lolling slightly with her movements in a grotesque parody of life. "Your tea, gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying that same whispery quality that seemed to fade before reaching the corners of the room. "I've taken the liberty of adding a touch of our honey to yours, Father, as you prefer." "Thank you, my dear," Thaddeus replied, accepting the cup she offered with a smile that, to Mercer's eye, seemed strained. When Abigail extended a cup toward him, Mercer hesitated, his mind racing through the possible consequences of either accepting or refusing. To drink might be dangerous, if his growing suspicions about the Blackwoods were correct. To refuse would be to openly demonstrate his distrust, potentially closing off any chance of learning more. In the end, caution won out. "Actually, Miss Blackwood, I find I'm not thirsty after all," he said, attempting a polite smile. "But I thank you for the thought." Something flickered in those mismatched eyes, annoyance perhaps, or a colder emotion that Mercer preferred not to name. "As you wish, Sheriff, though I assure you, our tea is quite excellent. Mother always said that hospitality was the mark of a civilized household." "Speaking of hospitality," Mercer said, seizing the opportunity to steer the conversation, "I understand you've been showing some kindness to young Thomas Henderson. His father mentioned that you'd been leaving gifts for the boy. If he had hoped to catch her off guard, he was disappointed." Abigail merely smiled, that same secret expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Thomas is a delightful child, so receptive. Most children these days are coarsened by too much freedom and too little discipline. But Thomas has a sweetness about him that is quite rare." The way she spoke in the present tense, just as her father had caused some of the tension in Mercer's shoulders to ease. Perhaps the family was simply away on an unannounced trip after all. Perhaps the dolls were merely an unfortunate coincidence. "The Hendersons are indeed good folk," he agreed cautiously, "which is why their sudden absence has caused such concern in town. If they had planned to travel, surely they would have informed someone." "One would think so," Abigail agreed, taking a seat in a high-backed chair near the window, the doll with Mercer's face still cradled in her arms. "But people can be unpredictable, can they not? Even the most seemingly reliable souls can surprise you with their actions." There was something in her tone, a hint of personal knowledge, perhaps even of satisfaction, that caused the sheriff's earlier unease to return in full force. He glanced at Thaddeus, who was sipping his tea with an expression of studied neutrality, then back to Abigail, who continued to stroke the hair of the doll that bore his likeness. "Miss Blackwood," he said, deciding that directness might yield better results than continued circling, "I couldn't help but notice that the doll you're holding bears a striking resemblance to me. May I ask when you created it?" Abigail's smile widened fractionally. "Do you like it, Sheriff? I finished it just this morning. I've been working on it for some time, actually, ever since you spoke at the Founders' Day celebration last month. You have such distinctive features. That wonderful scar through your eyebrow, the particular set of your jaw. A doll maker's dream, truly." "It's remarkably accurate," Mercer admitted, fighting to keep his tone casual. "You have quite a gift for observation." "Abigail sees more than most," Thaddeus interjected, setting down his now empty teacup. "It's what makes her work so exceptional. She captures not just the physical likeness, but something of the essence of her subjects." The way he said subjects, rather than models, sent another chill down Mercer's spine. He was beginning to feel that he had stumbled into something far more complex and dangerous than a simple missing persons case. Yet what exactly was he dealing with? Eccentric artistry? Unhealthy obsession? Or something more sinister? "I'd like to see your workroom, Miss Blackwood," he said suddenly, the words emerging before he had fully formed the thought. "If you wouldn't mind showing me where you create these remarkable dolls." Father and daughter exchanged a glance that contained volumes of unspoken communication. For the first time since his arrival, Mercer saw something like genuine emotion cross Thaddeus's face. A flicker of alarm, quickly suppressed. "I'm afraid Abigail's workroom is quite private, Sheriff," the doctor said smoothly. "She finds that the creative process requires solitude and silence. Perhaps another time, when she's completed her current project." "It's a sacred space," Abigail added, her fingers still moving through the hair of the Mercer doll in a manner that the sheriff found increasingly disturbing. Mother always said that artists need their sanctuaries. You wouldn't ask a priest to show you the confessional, would you? The comparison struck Mercer as odd, but he let it pass. Of course, I understand the need for privacy. Perhaps another time, as your father suggests. He rose from his chair, sensing that he would learn nothing more of value from this interview. At least nothing the Blackwoods were willing to reveal openly. Thank you both for your time. If you happen to hear from the Hendersons or recall anything that might help locate them, I trust you'll send word immediately. Without question, Thaddeus assured him, also standing. The welfare of our neighbors is of paramount concern to us. As the doctor led him back through the house toward the front entrance, Mercer found his gaze drawn once more to the multitude of dolls that filled the spaces they passed through. Now that he was looking more carefully, he could identify several that bore unmistakable resemblances to other residents of Whispering Hollow. Mrs. Peterson, who ran the hat shop, old Mr. Granger, who tended the stable, the Wilson twins, who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. And there, on a shelf nearly hidden in a small alcove, 3 dolls arranged in a family grouping. Caleb, Mary, and Thomas Henderson, their porcelain faces frozen in expressions of perpetual surprise. Mercer slowed his steps, pretending interest in a painting on the opposite wall while he studied the dolls from the corner of his eye. There was something different about these 3, something in the quality of their construction that set them apart from the others. The stitching on their clothing seemed fresher, the paint on their faces more vibrant, and their eyes seemed to follow him, pleading for something he couldn't quite understand. Fascinating work, isn't it? Thaddeus commented, noticing Mercer's attention. That particular set is among Abigail's most recent creations. She calls it The Happy Family. A bit sentimental perhaps, but touching in its way. Mercer nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He had seen enough, more than enough, to convince him that his and Miller's concerns were well-founded. Something was deeply wrong in the Blackwood household, something that went beyond mere strangeness or artistic obsession. At the front door, Thaddeus extended his hand. A pleasure, Sheriff. Despite the circumstances, do let us know when the Hendersons return. Abigail will want to resume her friendship with young Thomas. Mercer shook the offered hand, noting how cold the doctor's fingers felt against his palm. Of course. Good day to you, Dr. Blackwood. As he mounted his horse and began the ride back to town, Mercer couldn't shake the image of those 3 dolls, their glass eyes seeming to beg for release from some unspeakable captivity. Nor could he forget the doll that bore his own face, now in Abigail's possession, a thought that filled him with a dread he couldn't entirely explain. By the time he reached the outskirts of Whispering Hollow, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the dusty road. Mercer had made up his mind. Tonight, he would gather a few trusted men, including Reverend Miller, and return to the Blackwood estate under cover of darkness. They would search the property thoroughly, focusing on Abigail's mysterious workroom and any outbuildings that might serve as hiding places. If the Hendersons were there, alive or otherwise, he would find them. What Tobias Mercer could not have known, as he rode toward town with purpose hardening his resolve, was that Abigail Blackwood stood at an upper window of the mansion, watching his departure with those mismatched eyes that saw far more than ordinary vision would allow. In her hands, she held not the doll that bore his likeness, but a needle and thread, poised to make the final stitches that would complete her newest creation. He knows, she whispered to the empty room, or perhaps to the dozens of glass eyes that watched her from every shelf and corner. Or he suspects, at the very least. Father won't be pleased. Behind her, from the shadows of her private chamber, came a soft, muffled sound, something between a whimper and a moan. Abigail turned, her pale face illuminated by a shaft of fading sunlight that transformed her features into a mask of otherworldly beauty. Hush now, she soothed, moving toward the source of the sound. It won't be long, and then you'll be perfect just like all the others. Wouldn't that be lovely? To be perfect forever. The only response was another muffled sound, weaker this time. Abigail smiled, turning the needle so that it caught the light. "I know it hurts," she admitted, her voice still carrying that gentle, almost motherly tone. "But Mother always said that beauty requires sacrifice. And you will be beautiful, Sheriff Mercer. I promise you that." In her mind's eye, she could already see him seated beside the Hendersons in her special collection, his glass eyes reflecting the candlelight, his stitched mouth forever frozen in an expression of dignified concern. He would make a fine addition, perhaps her finest yet. And after him, the Reverend. And after the Reverend, whoever else came looking for them all. Whispering Hollow was such a small town, after all. In time, she would have them all. The hour was late when Sheriff Mercer met again with Reverend Miller in the small lamplit office behind the jailhouse. The room, normally reserved for official business and the occasional interrogation, now served as a war council of sorts, with maps of the Blackwood property spread across the scarred wooden desk. "They're hiding something," Mercer stated flatly, jabbing a finger at the location of the main house. "The way they spoke about the Hendersons, the way they avoided certain questions. And those dolls, Jonathan, you were right about them. They're not just similar to the townspeople. They're exact copies." Miller nodded grimly, his normally peaceful features troubled in the dim light. "I feared as much. Did you see the one that resembles young Thomas?" "That and more," Mercer confirmed, "including one with my own face, which Abigail claims to have finished just this morning." He suppressed a shudder at the memory. "There's something profoundly wrong happening in that house, and I mean to find out what it is tonight." "Tonight?" Miller echoed, alarm evident in his tone. "Surely it would be wiser to wait for daylight? To gather more men?" Mercer shook his head firmly. "Every hour we delay puts the Hendersons, if they're still alive, in greater danger. And frankly, I'm not certain how many in town would be willing to move against the Blackwoods based on nothing more concrete than disturbing dolls and odd behavior." The Reverend couldn't argue with this assessment. Despite the general unease that Abigail inspired, the Blackwood name still carried weight in Whispering Hollow. Thaddeus had served as the town's primary physician for decades, delivering many of the current residents into the world. To accuse him of involvement in a disappearance or worse would require evidence more substantial than they currently possessed. "Who will accompany us then?" Miller asked, accepting the inevitable. "I've spoken to Samuel Green and his brothers Jacob and Eli," Mercer replied. "Good men, all of them. Steady hands who can keep their mouths shut. They'll meet us at the crossroads near Willow Creek at midnight." The Reverend raised an eyebrow. "The Greens? They're farmers, not lawmen. They're also the closest neighbors to the Blackwood estate, and they know every inch of those woods." Mercer folded the maps with decisive movements. "Besides, Samuel's wife is Mary Henderson's sister. He has a personal stake in finding the family." Miller nodded, conceding the point. "Very well. Midnight at Willow Creek. Should we be armed?" And there, on a shelf nearly hidden in a small alcove, 3 dolls arranged in a family grouping. Caleb, Mary, and Thomas Henderson, their porcelain faces frozen in expressions of perpetual surprise. Mercer slowed his steps, pretending interest in a painting on the opposite wall while he studied the dolls from the corner of his eye. There was something different about these 3, something in the quality of their construction that set them apart from the others. The stitching on their clothing seemed fresher, the paint on their faces more vibrant, and their eyes seemed to follow him, pleading for something he couldn't quite understand. "Fascinating work, isn't it?" Thaddeus commented, noticing Mercer's attention. "That particular set is among Abigail's most recent creations. She calls it The Happy Family. A bit sentimental perhaps, but touching in its way." Mercer nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He had seen enough, more than enough, to convince him that his and Miller's concerns were well-founded. Something was deeply wrong in the Blackwood household, something that went beyond mere strangeness or artistic obsession. At the front door, Thaddeus extended his hand. "A pleasure, Sheriff. Despite the circumstances, do let us know when the Hendersons return. Abigail will want to resume her friendship with young Thomas." Mercer shook the offered hand, noting how cold the doctor's fingers felt against his palm. "Of course. Good day to you, Dr. Blackwood." As he mounted his horse and began the ride back to town, Mercer couldn't shake the image of those three dolls, their glass eyes seeming to beg for release from some unspeakable captivity. Nor could he forget the doll that bore his own face, now in Abigail's possession, a thought that filled him with a dread he couldn't entirely explain. By the time he reached the outskirts of Whispering Hollow, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the dusty road. Mercer had made up his mind. Tonight, he would gather a few trusted men, including Reverend Miller, and return to the Blackwood estate under cover of darkness. They would search the property thoroughly, focusing on Abigail's mysterious workroom and any outbuildings that might serve as hiding places. If the Hendersons were there, alive or otherwise, he would find them. What Tobias Mercer could not have known, as he rode toward town with purpose hardening his resolve, was that Abigail Blackwood stood at an upper window of the mansion, watching his departure with those mismatched eyes that saw far more than ordinary vision would allow. In her hands, she held not the doll that bore his likeness, but a needle and thread, poised to make the final stitches that would complete her newest creation. "He knows," she whispered to the empty room, or perhaps to the dozens of glass eyes that watched her from every shelf and corner. "Or he suspects, at the very least. Father won't be pleased." Behind her, from the shadows of her private chamber, came a soft, muffled sound, something between a whimper and a moan. Abigail turned, her pale face illuminated by a shaft of fading sunlight that transformed her features into a mask of otherworldly beauty. "Hush now," she soothed, moving toward the source of the sound. "It won't be long, and then you'll be perfect just like all the others. Wouldn't that be lovely? To be perfect forever." The only response was another muffled sound, weaker this time. Abigail smiled, turning the needle so that it caught the light. "I know it hurts," she admitted, her voice still carrying that gentle, almost motherly tone. "But Mother always said that beauty requires sacrifice. And you will be beautiful, Sheriff Mercer. I promise you that." In her mind's eye, she could already see him seated beside the Hendersons in her special collection, his glass eyes reflecting the candlelight, his stitched mouth forever frozen in an expression of dignified concern. He would make a fine addition, perhaps her finest yet. And after him, the Reverend. And after the Reverend, whoever else came looking for them all. Whispering Hollow was such a small town, after all. In time, she would have them all. The hour was late when Sheriff Mercer met again with Reverend Miller in the small lamplit office behind the jailhouse. The room, normally reserved for official business and the occasional interrogation, now served as a war council of sorts, with maps of the Blackwood property spread across the scarred wooden desk. "They're hiding something," Mercer stated flatly, jabbing a finger at the location of the main house. "The way they spoke about the Hendersons, the way they avoided certain questions. And those dolls, Jonathan, you were right about them. They're not just similar to the townspeople. They're exact copies." Miller nodded grimly, his normally peaceful features troubled in the dim light. "I feared as much. Did you see the one that resembles young Thomas?" "That and more," Mercer confirmed, "including one with my own face, which Abigail claims to have finished just this morning." He suppressed a shudder at the memory. "There's something profoundly wrong happening in that house, and I mean to find out what it is tonight." "Tonight?" Miller echoed, alarm evident in his tone. "Surely it would be wiser to wait for daylight? To gather more men?" Mercer shook his head firmly. "Every hour we delay puts the Hendersons, if they're still alive, in greater danger. And frankly, I'm not certain how many in town would be willing to move against the Blackwoods based on nothing more concrete than disturbing dolls and odd behavior." The Reverend couldn't argue with this assessment. Despite the general unease that Abigail inspired, the Blackwood name still carried weight in Whispering Hollow. Thaddeus had served as the town's primary physician for decades, delivering many of the current residents into the world. To accuse him of involvement in a disappearance or worse would require evidence more substantial than they currently possessed. "Who will accompany us then?" Miller asked, accepting the inevitable. "I've spoken to Samuel Green and his brothers Jacob and Eli," Mercer replied. "Good men, all of them. Steady hands who can keep their mouths shut." They'll meet us at the crossroads near Willow Creek at midnight. The Reverend raised an eyebrow. The Greens? They're farmers, not lawmen. They're also the closest neighbors to the Blackwood estate, and they know every inch of those woods. Mercer folded the maps with decisive movements. Besides, Samuel's wife is Mary Henderson's sister. He has a personal stake in finding the family. Miller nodded, conceding the point. Very well. Midnight at Willow Creek. Should we be armed? It was a question that revealed how far beyond normal procedures they had ventured. For a man of the cloth to inquire about weapons suggested a level of threat that transcended ordinary concerns. I'll provide what's necessary, Mercer assured him. Though I pray we won't need firearms. This is a search mission, not a raid. We find the Hendersons, we bring them home safely, and we deal with the Blackwoods according to the law. The Reverend's expression suggested he was not entirely convinced by this orderly scenario, but he raised no further objections. I shall pray for our success, he said simply, and for the safety of the Henderson family. As Miller took his leave, slipping out through the rear door to avoid being seen, Mercer turned his attention to preparing for the night's expedition. He cleaned and loaded his revolver with methodical precision, checked that his shotgun was in working order, and gathered extra ammunition for both. He also packed a bullseye lantern, rope, and a small medical kit, essential items for any search and rescue operation. Yet, as he worked, he found himself repeatedly glancing at his own reflection in the small mirror that hung on the office wall. The face that looked back at him was haggard with worry and lack of sleep, but unmistakably his own. The same face that Abigail Blackwood had somehow captured in porcelain and cloth with such uncanny accuracy. How had she done it? When had she observed him closely enough to recreate every line and feature, right down to the small scar through his eyebrow? The thought of being watched, studied so intimately without his knowledge, made his skin crawl. By the time midnight approached, Mercer had composed himself sufficiently to present a confident front to the men who would accompany him. He rode out of town quietly, avoiding the main street where late revelers from the tavern might spot him and ask inconvenient questions. The night was clear but moonless, the spring air carrying a hint of the previous day's rain. As he approached the appointed meeting place, Mercer could make out 4 figures waiting in the shadows of a massive willow tree, their horses tethered nearby. The Green brothers and Reverend Miller had all kept their appointment. Sheriff Samuel Green greeted him in a hushed voice, a barrel-chested man of 30 with a thick red beard and calloused hands. He had the steady demeanor of someone accustomed to hard work and careful planning. His younger brothers, twins Jacob and Eli, stood flanking him like guards. We're ready when you are. Mercer dismounted, tying his horse alongside theirs before addressing the small group. I appreciate you coming, all of you. What we're doing tonight isn't strictly within the bounds of my authority as sheriff. I want to be clear about that. We have suspicions, not proof. And under normal circumstances, I'd need a warrant to search the Blackwood property. These ain't normal circumstances, Samuel replied grimly. Mary and Caleb and little Thomas have been gone for days now. If there's even a chance they're being held at the Blackwood place. He left the sentence unfinished, his meaning clear. We'll approach from the north, Mercer continued, unfolding one of the maps he had brought. There's a service path that leads to the kitchen garden and the old carriage house. Less likely to be noticed that way than coming up the main drive. The carriage house has been abandoned for years, Jacob Green noted. Thaddeus keeps his buggy in the small stable attached to the main house now. All the more reason to check it first, Mercer pointed out. If they're holding the Hendersons somewhere on the property, an unused building would be ideal, isolated, but close enough to monitor. The men nodded in agreement, and after a brief review of their plans searched the outbuildings first. Then, if necessary, enter the main house itself. They mounted their horses and set off through the woods that bordered the Blackwood estate. They rode in silence, each man absorbed in his own thoughts and concerns. For Mercer, those thoughts continually returned to the image of Abigail Blackwood and her dolls, particularly the 3 that resembled the missing family, arranged in that mockery of domestic tranquility. There had been something about their eyes, something that had stirred a nameless dread in his heart. The approach to the Blackwood estate from the north was more challenging than the main drive, requiring them to navigate through densely wooded terrain before emerging near the sprawling garden that had once been Eleanor Blackwood's pride and joy. In the years since her death, it had fallen into a state of semi-wildness, with herbs and vegetables competing with encroaching weeds and wild roses scrambling over neglected trellises. Beyond the garden stood the carriage house, a substantial structure that, in its heyday, had housed not only the family's various conveyances, but also provided quarters for their driver and groom. Now it presented a forlorn appearance, with shuttered windows and a sagging roof that spoke of years of neglect. "We'll leave the horses here," Mercer whispered as they dismounted at the edge of the woods. "Less chance of them making noise that might alert someone in the main house." After securing their mounts, the 5 men approached the carriage house on foot, moving as quietly as their various levels of woodcraft allowed. Reverend Miller, to his credit, managed to avoid the worst of the dry twigs and rustling underbrush, though he could not match the near-silent progress of the Green brothers, who moved through the darkness with the ease of men born and raised in these woods. At the weathered door of the carriage house, Mercer paused, listening intently for any sound from within. Hearing nothing, he tried the handle. Locked as expected. He glanced at Samuel, who nodded and stepped forward with a set of simple lockpicks tools that, in other circumstances, Mercer might have questioned a law-abiding farmer possessing. "My grandfather was a locksmith in Savannah," Samuel explained quietly, noticing the sheriff's raised eyebrow. "Taught me a few things before he passed." The lock was old and simple, yielding to Samuel's efforts within minutes. As the door creaked open, Mercer raised his bullseye lantern, shielding most of its light to provide just enough illumination to prevent them from stumbling in the darkness. The interior of the carriage house was dusty and cobwebbed, with the musty smell of long abandonment. The main floor, once home to the family's carriages, was now empty save for a few broken pieces of furniture and some rotting harness leather hanging from pegs on the wall. A staircase led to what had once been the living quarters for the servants. "Jacob, Eli, check upstairs," Mercer instructed in a whisper. "Samuel, you and the Reverend help me search this level. Look for any signs of recent activity, footprints in the dust, moved objects, anything that suggests someone has been here in the past week." The twins nodded and ascended the stairs with careful steps, while Mercer, Samuel, and Miller began a methodical examination of the ground floor. It quickly became apparent that the carriage house, whatever secrets it might once have held, had not been used in any significant way for years. The dust lay thick and undisturbed on every surface, and the few footprints they found were clearly old dried mud from seasons past. Jacob and Eli returned from their inspection of the upper floor with similar findings. "Nothing," Jacob reported quietly. "No sign that anyone's been up there recently." "There's the stable next," Samuel suggested, his voice tight with the strain of maintained hope. "Or the root cellar behind the kitchen. That's where Eleanor used to store preserves and such." Mercer nodded, leading the way back outside. The main house loomed in the distance, its dark windows like blind eyes staring out into the night. Only one showed a faint glow, an upper floor room that Mercer guessed might be Abigail's workshop, or perhaps Thaddeus's study. They approached the stable with the same caution they had shown at the carriage house. This building, unlike its counterpart, showed signs of regular use. The doctor's buggy was visible through the half-open doors, and the single stall contained a well-groomed bay gelding that whickered softly as they entered. Again, they found nothing to indicate the presence of captives or any unusual activity. The root cellar, similarly, yielded nothing but ancient jars of preserves and a few sprouting potatoes forgotten in a corner. "That leaves the main house," Reverend Miller said quietly, voicing what they all knew but had hoped to avoid. "If the Hendersons are here, they must be inside." Mercer hesitated, weighing their options. Entering a private residence without permission or a warrant was a serious breach of his authority as sheriff. If he was wrong about the Blackwoods, if the family was innocent of wrongdoing, such an action could cost him his position and possibly lead to legal consequences for all of them. And yet the memory of those 3 dolls with their pleading eyes, the unnatural interest Abigail had shown in young Thomas, the evasiveness of both Blackwoods when questioned directly about the Hendersons, All of it pointed to something sinister that demanded investigation. "We'll try the back entrance through the kitchen," he decided finally. "If we're fortunate, they'll both be asleep at this hour. We can search the ground floor first, then move upstairs if necessary." Samuel nodded grimly, his hand moving to the handle of the hunting knife sheathed at his belt. "And if they're not asleep? If they find us inside? Then I'll deal with them according to the law," Mercer replied firmly. "But let's be clear, we're here to find the Hendersons, not to confront the Blackwoods unless absolutely necessary. If we locate the family, we get them out safely, then return with proper authority to handle the rest." This approach seemed to satisfy the Green brothers, though Reverend Miller looked troubled by the moral ambiguities of their situation. Nevertheless, he followed as they made their way across the overgrown garden toward the rear of the mansion. The kitchen entrance was locked, but again, Samuel's skills proved equal to the task. As the door swung open, Mercer raised his lantern slightly, revealing a large, well-appointed kitchen that, unlike much of the house he had seen earlier, appeared to be in regular use. Copper pots hung from a rack above a massive iron stove, and a variety of herbs dried in bunches from the ceiling beams. They entered cautiously, each man moving with exaggerated care to avoid making noise. Mercer closed the lantern shutter further, leaving just enough light to navigate by without risking detection. They had just begun to move toward the door that presumably led to the main part of the house when Jacob Green's foot caught the edge of a braided rug, causing him to stumble slightly. He caught himself on the edge of a heavy wooden table, but not before dislodging a ceramic bowl that had been resting there. The bowl hit the floor with a crash that seemed deafening in the midnight stillness of the house. For a long, breathless moment, the 5 men froze in place, straining to hear any response from within the mansion. Seconds stretched into a minute, then 2, with no sound of approaching footsteps or voices raised in alarm. "Perhaps they're deeper sleepers than we thought," Miller whispered hopefully. Before anyone could respond, a voice spoke from the darkness of the doorway, a soft, feminine voice that sent a chill down Mercer's spine. "Or perhaps we were expecting you, Sheriff Mercer." Abigail Blackwood stood in the doorway, a candelabra in one hand, casting her sharp features into dramatic relief. She wore a white nightgown, her black hair loose around her shoulders in a manner that, in any other circumstance, might have been considered improper for a young woman to appear before men not of her family. But there was nothing vulnerable or embarrassed in her posture. She regarded them with the calm confidence of a hostess who had anticipated late-arriving guests. "Miss Blackwood," Mercer acknowledged, straightening to his full height and doing his best to project authority despite the awkwardness of being caught breaking into a private home. "I apologize for the intrusion, but we have reason to believe that the Henderson family may be on your property against their will." Abigail tilted her head slightly, regarding him with those mismatched eyes that seemed to glow in the candlelight. "How fascinating. And what led you to this conclusion, Sheriff? The dolls, I presume? Or has someone been spreading more colorful tales about my father and me?" Before Mercer could respond, Samuel Green pushed forward, his face flushed with anger and fear for his missing relatives. "Where are they?" he demanded. "What have you done with Mary and Caleb and the boy?" Something flickered across Abigail's face, amusement perhaps, or a colder emotion that Mercer couldn't quite identify. "Mr. Green, isn't it? Mary's brother-in-law." She spoke as if she had known him for years. "She spoke of you, you know. Said you had a temper." She smiled, that same small, secretive expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Please, gentlemen, since you've gone to such trouble to visit us at this ungodly hour, you might as well come in properly. Father is in the parlor. He's been expecting you as well." With that, she turned and moved deeper into the house, clearly expecting them to follow. Mercer exchanged glances with the others, a silent debate about whether to proceed or to retreat and return with more men, more authority. In the end, curiosity and concern for the Hendersons won out. They followed Abigail through the dimly lit corridors, past walls lined with watching dolls, to a parlor where Thaddeus Blackwood sat in a high-backed chair before a small fire. Unlike his daughter, he was fully dressed, as though he had never retired for the night at all. Sheriff Mercer, he greeted them, rising with that same fluid grace Mercer had noted earlier. Reverend Miller and the Green brothers, if I'm not mistaken. What an unexpected gathering. Dr. Blackwood, Mercer acknowledged stiffly. I'll come straight to the point. We're searching for the Henderson family, and we have reason to believe they may be here, perhaps not of their own free will. Thaddeus raised an eyebrow, his expression one of mild surprise rather than the outrage one might expect from a man whose home had just been invaded. A serious accusation, Sheriff. May I ask what evidence has led you to this conclusion? Before Mercer could formulate a response that wouldn't sound absurd, dolls with the Hendersons' faces, Abigail's strange interest in Thomas, the family's unexplained absence, Samuel Green stepped forward again. Enough of this, he growled. We know they're here. The whole town knows about your daughter's unnatural obsession with dolls that look like real people. Just tell us where they are, and we'll be on our way. Thaddeus regarded him calmly, showing no sign of intimidation despite Samuel's imposing size and obvious anger. My daughter is an artist, Mr. Green. Artists often find inspiration in the world around them. That her dolls bear resemblance to certain individuals is hardly evidence of wrongdoing. Father, Abigail interrupted softly, moving to stand beside his chair. Perhaps we should simply show them. After all, they've come all this way in the middle of the night. It seems cruel to deny them what they seek. A look passed between father and daughter, a silent communication that seemed to convey volumes. After a moment, Thaddeus nodded. Perhaps you're right, my dear. The workroom. Then, Abigail smiled, that same secret expression that never seemed to warm her eyes. Yes, I think that would be best. They should see my latest creations. I'm particularly proud of the Henderson collection. So lifelike, don't you think? The casual way she referred to the missing family sent a wave of cold dread through Mercer. He glanced at the Green brothers, noting how their hands had moved closer to their weapons, and at Miller, whose face had gone pale with apprehension. Lead the way, Miss Blackwood, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. We would indeed like to see this collection. Abigail turned without another word and glided from the parlor, the men following behind her with varying degrees of trepidation. Thaddeus brought up the rear, his footsteps so quiet that Mercer found himself repeatedly glancing back to ensure the doctor was still with them. They ascended a grand staircase to the second floor, then continued up a narrower set of stairs to what must have been the third story, or perhaps an attic space. The air grew noticeably warmer as they climbed, and Mercer detected that same sweet, cloying scent he had noticed in Thaddeus's study earlier, stronger now, almost overwhelming. At the top of the stairs, Abigail paused before a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands. From her nightgown pocket, she produced an ornate key, which she inserted into the lock with a flourish reminiscent of a magician about to reveal her greatest trick. Gentlemen, she announced, welcome to my sanctuary. The door swung open to reveal a large circular room that must have occupied the entirety of the mansion's highest level. Dozens of candles burned in holders around the perimeter, casting the space in a warm golden light that seemed at odds with the chill that had settled in Mercer's bones. The room was dominated by a massive workbench in its center, cluttered with the tools of the doll maker's craft, needles and thread of various sizes, tiny scissors, pots of paint, brushes, and what appeared to be surgical instruments alongside more conventional woodworking tools. Shelves lined the walls, each filled with dolls in various stages of completion, their blank eyes seeming to follow the visitors as they entered. But it was not these half-finished creations that caused Samuel Green to let out a strangled cry, nor that made Reverend Miller fall to his knees in prayer. It was what stood, or rather sat, in a semicircle of chairs arranged near the room's single window. Caleb, Mary, and Thomas Henderson, positioned as though engaged in quiet family conversation. Caleb in the center, one arm extended as if in mid-gesture. Mary beside him, her head tilted in attentive listening. Young Thomas at his father's feet, a wooden toy soldier clutched in his small hand. They were perfectly still, perfectly silent, perfectly preserved. Their skin had the waxy sheen of the finest porcelain. Their eyes, glass now, not flesh, caught the candlelight with an unnatural gleam. Their clothes were their own, meticulously arranged and stitched in places where alterations had been necessary. Their hair, still their own as well, had been carefully styled. Mary's auburn dresses arranged in an elegant style she had likely never worn in life. They had been posed with loving attention to detail, positioned to create the illusion of a family moment frozen in time. And across their mouths, so subtly done that it was almost invisible unless one looked closely, ran fine, nearly imperceptible stitches that had sealed their lips forever. "Beautiful, aren't they?" Abigail said, her voice carrying that same maternal pride Mercer had noted when she spoke of her dolls earlier. "My finest work to date, though I'm particularly pleased with how young Thomas turned out. Children are so much more difficult. Their proportions require special attention." Samuel let out a howl of anguish, a sound so primal that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. He lunged toward Abigail, his grief transformed instantly to rage, only to be intercepted by Thaddeus, who moved with a speed that belied his years. The doctor grasped Samuel's arm with surprising strength, twisting it in a way that brought the larger man to his knees. Now, he chided, as though speaking to an unruly child. "That's no way to show appreciation for my daughter's artistry." Mercer had his revolver out in an instant, leveling it at Thaddeus's head. "Release him," he commanded, his voice hard with authority and barely controlled horror. "Release him now, Dr. Blackwood, or I swear to God I'll put a bullet through your skull." Thaddeus complied, stepping back with his hands raised slightly in a gesture of compliance. But there was no fear in his expression, only a kind of amused tolerance, as though he were humoring a child playing at being an adult. "There's no need for violence, Sheriff," he said mildly. "We merely wish to show you what you came to see. The Henderson family is here as you suspected. They are quite safe, I assure you, safer than they ever were in life. Preserved now, perfect and unchanging. Isn't that what everyone truly desires? To arrest the decay of time, to remain forever at one's peak of beauty and vigor." Beside him, Abigail nodded in agreement, her gaze fixed lovingly on the seated figures of the Hendersons. "They were my most challenging subjects yet," she said, as though discussing nothing more sinister than portrait paintings. "Especially Caleb, he fought so hard at first, you see. But Father's specialty soon calmed him, just as it did Mary and little Thomas." The implication of her words, that the Hendersons had been alive when brought to this room, alive when Abigail began her work, sent a wave of nausea through Mercer so powerful that he nearly lost his grip on his weapon. You murdered them," he managed, his voice thick with horror. "You killed them and turned them into dolls." Abigail looked genuinely offended by this characterization. "Murdered? What a crude term, Sheriff. I elevated them, transformed them into art. They will never age now, never sicken, never die. They are perfect, eternal." She moved to stand behind Thomas's small figure, resting her hands gently on his golden curls. "And they will always be together, a family united forever. Isn't that beautiful?" Samuel had begun to weep harsh, racking sobs that shook his powerful frame as he knelt on the floor, staring at the remains of his sister-in-law and her family. Jacob and Eli stood frozen in shock, their eyes wide with disbelief and revulsion. Only Reverend Miller seemed to have regained some measure of composure, his lips moving in silent prayer as he slowly rose to his feet. "This is madness," Mercer said, his revolver still trained on Thaddeus. "Absolute madness. You will both hang for this." Thaddeus smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his austere features into something almost handsome. "I think not, Sheriff. You see, no one will believe you. The respectable Dr. Blackwood and his talented, if somewhat reclusive daughter, turning people into dolls? It sounds like the ravings of a lunatic, does it not? And even if you were to convince some that your tale is true, what proof would you offer? The Hendersons appear to be dolls, exceptionally lifelike dolls, but dolls nonetheless. Any examination would simply confirm Abigail's extraordinary skill as an artist. And by the time you returned with more men, with doctors and officials," Abigail added, "we would be long gone, taking our collection with us. We've relocated before when necessary, haven't we, Father. The casual revelation that the Hendersons were not their first victims struck Mercer like a physical blow. How many others had there been? How many towns before Whispering Hollow had the Blackwoods visited, leaving behind a trail of mysterious disappearances? "You won't be going anywhere," he stated flatly. "You're both under arrest for the murders of Caleb, Mary, and Thomas Henderson." Jacob, Eli bind their hands. "We're taking them back to town." Before either of the twins could move to comply, Abigail laughed, a sound like breaking glass that seemed to fill the room and echo from every direction at once. "Oh, Sheriff," she said, her mismatched eyes gleaming with an inner light that was not entirely human. "Did you truly believe we would allow ourselves to be taken? That we invited you here simply to admire my work before surrendering to your authority?" As she spoke, Mercer became aware of movement in the shadows behind the shelves, a rustling, shifting motion accompanied by the soft click of porcelain limbs and the whisper of cloth against cloth. To his horror, he realized that what he had taken for inanimate dolls were beginning to stir, glass eyes blinking, stitched mouths stretching into grotesque approximations of smiles. "My children," Abigail crooned, extending her arms as though to embrace the entire room. "My beautiful children, these men have come to separate us, to take me away from you. We can't allow that, can we?" The dolls, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, began to advance from all corners of the circular room, moving with jerky yet purposeful motions. Their painted faces remained frozen in those unsettling smiles, but their eyes, those glass eyes that had seemed to plead with Mercer earlier, now burned with an unholy light. "What devilry is this?" Reverend Miller gasped, clutching his Bible before him like a shield. "God preserve us." Thaddeus watched the advancing dolls with the proud expression of a father observing his children's achievements. "Not devilry, Reverend. Science, or perhaps a bit of both. My late wife had certain knowledge passed down through generations of her family. Knowledge of how to preserve not just the body, but something of the essence as well. Abigail inherited her gift and, under my guidance, has perfected it. They're still in there," Abigail added, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. "A spark of what they were, bound to my will enough to animate the form, to serve as I direct. Not fully conscious, of course, that would be cruel. Just aware enough." Mercer fired his revolver at the nearest advancing doll, a creation that bore the unmistakable features of a man he recognized as a traveler who had passed through Whispering Hollow the previous autumn and never been seen again. The bullet struck the doll in the chest, tearing through cloth and whatever lay beneath. But the creature didn't fall. It merely staggered slightly before continuing its relentless approach. "Conventional weapons won't stop them, Sheriff," Thaddeus informed him almost apologetically. "They feel no pain, need no breath, fear no injury. They exist now only to serve my daughter's will." As the dolls closed in, Mercer made a desperate decision. "The lantern," he shouted to the Green brothers. "Use the lantern. Burn this place down." Jacob responded instantly, hurling his bullseye lantern at the nearest shelf of half-completed dolls. The glass shattered, spilling oil that caught fire immediately, flames racing up the wooden shelving and leaping to the dry timber of the attic ceiling. "No!" Abigail screamed, her composure shattering for the first time. "My children! My precious children!" She lunged toward the spreading fire, only to be restrained by her father. "There's no time, Abigail," Thaddeus urged, pulling her toward a door half-hidden behind a tapestry. "We must go now. We can start again elsewhere, as we always have." The dolls, momentarily confused by the conflict between Abigail's desires, had paused in their advance, giving Mercer and his companions a brief opportunity. "The stairs!" he shouted above the growing roar of the flames. "Go! All of you! Now!" Samuel had to be dragged away from the seated figures of the Hendersons, his grief momentarily overwhelming his instinct for survival. "We can't leave them like this," he protested, struggling against his brother's grip. "They're already gone, Samuel," Miller told him, his voice gentle but firm. "Their souls are with God now. These are just shells. Let them burn." As they retreated down the narrow staircase, Mercer glanced back to see Thaddeus and Abigail disappearing through the hidden door, a few of the more mobile dolls following after them like macabre attendants. The remainder stood amidst the growing inferno, their painted faces melting, their glass eyes reflecting the dance of flames as they silently burned. The fire spread with unnatural speed, as though the very house had been waiting for this cleansing blaze. By the time Mercer and the others staggered out into the cool night air, the upper floor was fully engulfed, and flames were beginning to lick at the windows of the second story. They retreated to the edge of the woods, watching in stunned silence as the Blackwood mansion was consumed. No one spoke of pursuing Thaddeus and Abigail. The horror they had witnessed in that attic room had left them all shaken to their cores, temporarily robbed of the will to do anything but bear witness to the destruction of that house of horrors. As dawn broke over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that contrasted cruelly with the pillar of black smoke still rising from the smoldering ruins, Mercer finally broke the silence. "We'll tell the town that the Hendersons perished in the fire," he said, his voice rough from smoke and emotion. "That we found evidence they were being held captive by the Blackwoods, who also died in the blaze. It's kinder that way, for the town and for the Hendersons' memory." The others nodded in mute agreement, none of them eager to speak the full truth of what they had seen. Who would believe them anyway? Who would accept that the respected Dr. Blackwood and his daughter had been transforming the living into grotesque dolls animated by some unholy fusion of science and witchcraft? "The Blackwoods?" Reverend Miller asked quietly. "They escaped. Should we not pursue them?" Mercer stared at the ruins of the mansion, where occasional flames still flickered amid the collapsed timbers. "We will," he promised. "I'll send telegrams to every sheriff and marshal within 100 miles. They won't find another town to prey upon. Not if I can help it." But even as he spoke the words, Mercer felt the weight of doubt. Thaddeus had implied that they had done this before, had moved from place to place when suspicion grew too great. How many years had they been practicing their horrific art? How skilled were they at disappearing, at creating new identities, at insinuating themselves into unsuspecting communities? And then there was the doll, the one with his own face that Abigail had completed just that morning. Had she taken it with her when she fled? Was it burning now in the ruins of her workshop? Or did she carry it still? A template for the sheriff who had discovered her secret and lived to tell the tale. A promise that one day she would return to complete her collection. As the sun rose fully above the trees, casting long shadows across the blackened skeleton of what had once been the grandest home in Whispering Hollow, Tobias Mercer made a silent vow. He would find the Blackwoods. He would bring them to justice for their unspeakable crimes. And he would never again dismiss the fearful whispers that sometimes arose about strangers who came to town, especially those with an unusual interest in creating lifelike dolls. For in the years that followed, rumors would occasionally reach Whispering Hollow tales from distant towns of a distinguished doctor and his talented daughter, of exquisite dolls that captured the very essence of their subjects, and of people who vanished without trace, leaving nothing behind but whispered questions and inexplicable grief. And on nights when the fog hung heavy over the Georgia pines, Tobias Mercer would wake from troubled dreams in which porcelain hands reached for him from the shadows, and a soft voice whispered promises of perfection that would last for eternity. In the small town of Millfield, some 80 miles north of what had once been Whispering Hollow, a new doctor had recently established his practice. Dr. Thomas Blackwell was a widower of dignified bearing and obvious education who had arrived with his daughter Emily, a quiet young woman with remarkable green eyes who rarely ventured into town except to purchase supplies for her doll making. Their home, while modest compared to their previous residence, was still one of the finest in the area. A handsome two-story structure set back from the main road, surrounded by tall pines that cast long shadows across the neatly tended garden. And if the townspeople sometimes felt uneasy in Emily Blackwell's presence, if they sometimes caught her studying their features with an intensity that bordered on inappropriate, they said nothing of it directly. After all, the dolls she created were truly extraordinary, so lifelike that they seemed almost to breathe, their glass eyes following visitors with an attentiveness that was uncanny yet somehow captivating. And when the son of the town's mayor went missing that first winter, Few thought to connect his disappearance with the new addition to Emily's collection. A doll with the same golden curls and bright blue eyes that young William Evans had possessed in life. Fewer still would have recognized the doll that sat in Emily's private workroom, hidden from casual visitors, a figure with a weathered face and gray eyes, a small scar cutting through one eyebrow, dressed in the distinctive clothing of a sheriff from a town that no longer appeared on any map. And none would have understood the significance of the name she had given this particular creation, Tobias, or why she spent so many hours perfecting its features, whispering to it promises of a reunion that would, in time, make her collection complete once more. For art, as Abigail Blackwood had often observed, required patience above all else. And she had all the time in the world to wait for her favorite subject to find her again, as she knew, with the certainty of true obsession, that he eventually would. After all, her dolls always came home to her in the end.